Today I have a very recent clip of Michael Saylor on Stephen Gardner's YouTube channel. Michael is asked why he thinks everyone should own Bitcoin and why he thinks Bitcoin can and will change the world for the better. Michael expertly defines inflation. Words actually matter. Consumer inflation is not the same as monetary or asset inflation. Consumer inflation is easy to manipulate. This clip ends with Michael comparing owning Bitcoin to owning desirable real estate, like this beachfront property in Miami.
I think you have to start with some ideas. I mean, many words are thrown around without us being very precise about it. So, for example, inflation is a word that refers to an increase in prices, but oftentimes that's then converted into consumer inflation, which is an increase in the price of a market basket of consumer goods defined by the government. But if you think broadly about what is inflation, inflation is simply the price appreciation of anything. And the economy consists of hundreds of thousands of things. And so there are hundreds of thousands of different inflation rates. And if you track the rate at which prices increase of consumer goods, you're going to generally get a low inflation rate. And if you have the flexibility to pick what goods you put in the consumer basket, you can pick consumer goods that have very little energy content or material content in them, that are easy to manufacture with capital or machinery or computers. And they will have a very, very low inflation rate. Because over 100 years, human beings get better at manufacturing things like streaming Netflix videos. If you think about the cost to manufacture Beethoven's Fifth Symphony 200 years ago or 100 years ago, it was an orchestra. It's very expensive. And the cost to listen to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony today would be not even a penny. So we're good at creating certain products or services. But on the other hand, other things you can't easily manufacture with capital or with a machine. An example of that would be an acre of beachfront property in Palm Beach. So if you track the inflation rate over 100 years, you might conclude it's 2% if you tracked the consumer basket of goods defined by a political organization. But if you actually were keeping track of the cost of gold over 100 years, you would find that that gold went up in price, not by a factor of 20, but by a factor of 100. So the inflation rate of consumer goods looks like 2%, but the inflation rate of gold looks like much higher, 4 or 5%. And if you actually looked at the rate at which an acre of land in Palm Beach goes up over 100 years, it goes up by a factor of nearly 1,000. So the inflation rate starts to look like 7 to 8% a year. So I think the first thing you have to consider is inflation is a vector. And if you focus upon consumer inflation, you're just looking at the price of highly manufactured products that generally have a quality that's deteriorating continually. And so consumer inflation is the amount of money you need to stay poor and live a lower middle class lifestyle. On the other hand, monetary inflation or asset inflation is the rate at which you have to accrete your wealth in order to stay wealthy, and if you want to become wealthy, you have to beat that number. So the monetary inflation rate in the US has been about 7 to 8% a year for 100 years. The consumer inflation rate's only been about 2% for 100 years. And so the reason that this is an interesting issue is right now those monetary inflation rates have exploded. The monetary inflation rate outside the US, especially in weaker countries, is often double. So it's 14% a year. And since COVID, monetary inflation rates leaped because as countries run large deficits, they actually print money that they can't pay back. And so the inflation rate of many scarce desirable assets went up much faster than 2%. In fact, the money supply expanded by 40% or more over a couple of years. So let's think about what is money, right? Well, everybody uses money to mean something different. Some people think of it as currency. Well, the dollar or the euro is a currency, a paper currency, used as a medium of exchange. Money, you could think of it as your economic energy or your wealth. So if we talk about, how do I keep my money? You could also think of it as capital. How do I keep my capital? Capital is like economic energy. So if you want to retain capital or you want to keep the value of your money, you're going to have to convert it from a currency into an asset. And then the question is, what asset? If you had all the money in the world and you bought up all the dollars 100 years ago, then the money supply, the currency supply of dollars doubles every 10 years. 7% a year means that every 10 years you cut the value of your holdings in half, by the law of exponential math. So think about what happens if I double the currency supply every 10 years for 100 years, right? 2 to the 10th, 1,000, whatever, 24, 48, whatever the number is. And so 1,000x. So what that means is if you had all the money in the world and you convert it to currency, you would have 0.1% of the money in the world in 100 years. 99.9% of all the money in the world would have been stripped from you and given to a friend of a politician. So the politicians get 99% of the money over 100 years. If you store your capital or your wealth in a currency inflating at 7% a year. If you store your wealth in a currency inflating at 14% a year, well, now you get cut in half every 5 years.
Wow.
So now it's much, much worse, right? And if you want to see an example of that, you look at the Argentine peso, where the peso was like 1 peso to the dollar 23 years ago. And right now it's 730 pesos to the dollar.
Oh my God.
Right. So you're looking at losing 99.7% of all of your wealth in 22 years or 23 years, right? Not even 100 years. So currencies are a pretty awful way to store your wealth. We can see that. It's not that much better if you store it in bonds, though, because if the bonds yield 3 or 4% interest, after tax, what that means is instead of a 7% inflation rate, it's a 3.5% inflation rate, which means that you lose 95% of your wealth over 100 years. Instead of 99.9, just 95 or 96% or something. So that doesn't work either. So then you got to say, well, what do I do? If you invest all of your money in the S&P index, then you might get a 7 to 8% gain a year over 100 years. It offsets the 7 to 8% monetary inflation. So you pretty much keep what you had over 100 years. If you actually look at the rate of scarce desirable real estate, like Miami Beach real estate, a home in Miami, or even better, acreage in Miami, you could have bought an acre in Miami between 10,000 and 20,000 an acre 100 years ago, and now you're looking at 10 million an acre. So you can see where that all takes you.
Yeah.
Land is a decent yardstick, right? Because no amount of factory will produce more beachfront property in Miami.
Yeah.
No amount of capital. So the problem with storing your economic wealth in gold is the gold supply increases 2% a year, which means every 35 years you get cut in half, which means you get cut in half 3 times over 100 years. So whatever you started with 100 years ago, you have 12.5% of that. You lose 88% of your value over 100 years. So, I mean, it's better than currency and it's better than bonds, but it's not great. So the question for any worker or even a corporation is how do you accumulate wealth or at least retain the wealth or the capital that you have over the course of a long period of time in an inflationary environment? And if we look at people in places like Africa, Nigeria, Argentina, Venezuela, Lebanon, Turkey, well, they have a weak currency and they have an unstable banking system. So whatever you have, you're likely to lose most of it, 95 to 99% of it within 20 years, just due to the currency debasement. But if you convert it to dollars and put it in a bank in one of those countries, the problem is the bank is likely to freeze your funds, convert it back into local currency and devalue it. So if you can't trust the local banking system and you can't trust the local currency, and if you're stuck in the country, then the issue is, how do you protect your capital, or how do you protect your wealth? And of course, that conclusion is you kind of have to convert your wealth into a liquid asset, and then you have to get it out of the country. But how do you do that, right? You can't just carry a bunch of money through an airport in the form of gold bars.
Yeah.
And so normally only
did you lose $1 million in Argentina trying to
yeah.
get the money out?
Well, generally I had the experience of, I had the $1 million in dollars in a bank in Argentina. But when the Argentines devalued the currency, first they froze everybody's assets. They locked it in the country, and then they converted it into pesos, and they devalued the peso 10 to 1. So
everything you're sharing is because you learned through the school of hard knocks.
Yeah, I learned the hard way, right? I mean, if you have capital in one of these countries, generally the risk is the bank will just steal it, or the currency will collapse, or some combination of some legal financial policies whereby the government freezes it, the bank converts it, then the currency is devalued, then it's frozen a bit more, then there's a capital control, and you end up just losing all your money. So Bitcoin represents it represents a new technology. I mean, a breakthrough technology, and there's a couple of benefits to it. The first benefit is it's the first digital monetary network in the history of the world. So it's capped at 21 million Bitcoin. So that means if you owned all the money in the world, you bought all the Bitcoin, you had 21 million Bitcoin. 100 years from now, you still have 21 million Bitcoin, right? I mean, there's no more Bitcoin coming.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, that's kind of hyperbolic, because obviously no one's going to have all the money in the world. But I mean, a better example is if you buy 1% of the Bitcoin, in 100 years, you'll still have 1% of the Bitcoin.
Yeah.
If you buy 1% of the gold in 100 years, you'll have 1/10 of that. You'll have, 0.12% of the gold. And if you buy 1% of the dollars in the world, you'll have, 0.1% of what you had 100 years from now. So Bitcoin is a conservative monetary network. In fact, there's no heat lapse, there's no leakage, there's no inflation. So if you're looking for something that you can hold for a long period of time, it's kind of like a freezer for your money, right? If money was food and it was spoiling over the course of days, you want a refrigerator, you put the food in the refrigerator, it doesn't spoil, right? Right. So Bitcoin is like that. It's a way to freeze your economic energy so that it doesn't dissipate. And that's the first big idea. But the second idea is Bitcoin's a bank in cyberspace. So it's kind of a bank, a money transfer network, and it's the money. So it's all three of those things. So this is not as important to Americans that have a bank they trust. But if you live in Africa and the bank is run by the cousin of the guy that just took over the country last week, then if you put your money in that bank, they're probably just going to take it. And if you want to convert your money from that local currency to another currency, they probably take half. Oftentimes, the capital controls are such that the country will fix the exchange rate at half of the real value. So every time you change money, you give half of it to the bank and you get the other half.
Wow.
And it's not a terribly fair thing for the proletariat. But what Bitcoin allows you to do is if I wanted to buy your car in Bitcoin, and then you would get the fair exchange rate for the Bitcoin, then you could hold the Bitcoin either on your own hardware device, you could be your own bank, or you could deposit the Bitcoin with a custodian somewhere outside of your country. Because Bitcoin is a global network. So everybody in the world, anybody can be a custodian of Bitcoin. So there's competition. So you would have an asset which is pure property, which is not being debased by capital. It's not being debased by manufacturing or devalued by manufacturing, and it's not being devalued by monetary inflation, right? And you would not have to rely upon the local banking system, the local government, or the local currency. All three of those are weak links. And if you look at wealthy people, most people that are wealthy in the world are wealthy because they converted their currency, whatever they earned, they converted into property. Like they bought, what does the royal family of the UK have? They own the middle of London. What does the emperor of Japan have? They own the middle of Tokyo, right? If you own a block in New York City or Paris, then when would you ever want to sell that? You probably never want to sell it. You want to keep it forever. Yeah. And if you want to stay wealthy, you buy that land and you hold it because it appreciates in value at the rate that the money collapses. But if you want to get wealthy, then you go leveraged long. So like if I can borrow a bunch of money, if I can borrow $10 million and buy $10 million worth of scarce desirable property, then every year it goes up in value 7%. And after 10 years, it's doubled in value. So now my $10 million acquisition is worth 20 million and I've got 10 million in equity. So then I refinance the property and I take out 5 million in equity and I live off of that without paying tax on it. And the next 10 years, the $20 million property is worth 40 million. And then after 10 more years, the 40 million is worth 80 million. So you see how your family starts to become very wealthy because your grandfather bought 10 blocks in the middle of New York or in the middle of Paris or some city. Of course, it has to be scarce desirable, right? People have to want to live there.
Yeah.
And so the risk is if you bought those 10 blocks in the middle of, Kansas, maybe it doesn't appreciate at the same rate. Generally, this strategy works well when you're buying land in the middle of Tokyo, London, Paris, or New York, right? We all know stories of wealthy people that bought that land. But you could think about Bitcoin as cyber Manhattan. Imagine I created a city in cyberspace that had only 21 million blocks, and one day 8 billion people will want to live there. And they're never going to make more than 21 million blocks. And all 8 billion people can move in, and there's no mayor to put a zoning restriction on it or pass a city tax. And there's no governor to put a state tax on it. And there's no president or Congress to put a national property tax on it. And when the place where you live decides to tax it, you can fly on an airplane, to Singapore or Monaco or some other place that will give you, or you can move from one state. Maybe you move from a high tax state to a low tax state, and then you keep your property. So Bitcoin represents digital property, and it represents a property right to 8 billion people that is being driven by the adoption of the billions of people. I mean, everybody in the world wants property rights. I mean, it's been the driving theme of human history for thousands and thousands of years. That's why people came to America. That's why they went west. That's why they went anywhere. So that's a very deep-seated theme in humanity. But the second thing is everybody wants money, and you either want it if you don't have it, or you want to keep it. Right. And there's a whole set of dynamics of people that are actually passing laws to basically deprive you of your money. If you own assets that generate rents, that's a currency derivative. The rents are going to be devalued. If you own bonds, that's a currency derivative. They're going to be devalued. And every single fiat currency in the world is built to be devalued. The only question is, Will it be devalued at 7% a year versus desirable assets? Or will it be devalued at 14% a year? Or will it be devalued at 40% a year? But it is 100% certain that the currencies will be devalued. The bonds are going to have a negative real yield. They'll be devalued. Value stocks and commercial real estate that's valued partially on the cash flows will be devalued. So Bitcoin kind of represents more like that trophy asset, like the one of a kind trophy piece of art, or the one in a kind franchise, or the one in a kind beachfront property. Everybody wants. It's not valued based on cash flows. It's valued based upon its scarcity and desirability. Now, we have lots of examples of people that buy Ferraris as a store of value, or Rolex as a store of value, or commercial art, or art as a store of value. But the ideal money is something liquid and fungible. And Bitcoin is liquid and fungible. So it's like that high quality, desirable real estate, but it's like buying a pure city block in the most desirable city on earth. And it's got a global brand, because it's not, Tokyo's only interesting if you speak Japanese, and Paris is maybe interesting if you speak French. But, Bitcoin is neutral in cyberspace. The Chinese like it, the Russians like it, the Americans like it, the Europeans like it, the Africans like it, the South Americans like it. Why wouldn't you like it, right? It passes this last Bernard Arnault test, which is, you ought to buy something that someone richer than you and more sophisticated than you will want to buy from you in a decade. And if that's what you're buying, then you're probably going to be okay.